running this morning. On the corner of 40, 14, and 7 by the light that flashes and blinks. Just on the other side, a pirate shack. At a house on the fence, there's a sign that says, "Beware of dog." If you don't see the sign, you make noise as you go by, the dog will make himself known. He's been vocal every time I run. Every time I go that way, he says what he has to say, he does what he has to do. And that sign is to declare to people in the vicinity, this might not be the place you want to mess with if you decide what you want to do is mess with somebody's house. Beware of dog. I stopped by here on my way to eternal fellowship with him to declare, beware of bankruptcy. Some of you may have seen the sign on the marquee when you drove up, and you may have wondered, is he trying to tell us something financial about the church on the slide? Because the only thought of bankruptcy that may have conjured up in your mind is the idea of a chapter 7 or a chapter 13 where someone is trying to not pay bills that they incurred and they consider bankruptcy a way out. That's not really the kind of bankruptcy that we're talking about this morning. To be bankrupt is to be completely lacking, to be without. There are people who are bankrupt emotionally, and they struggle to not be depressed. There are people who are bankrupt in other areas of life, perhaps relationally, and they struggle to interact with others. If you find yourself unprepared and bankrupt, you may seek a solution that is permanent to a problem that's temporary. So I want to encourage you today to beware of bankruptcy, no matter where it may find itself in your life. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. And the third verse in the New King James Version declares, "And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing." The Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 3, the Message, says, "No matter what I say, what I believe, or what I do, I am bankrupt without love." According to Acts chapter 18, Paul preached Sabbath after Sabbath after Sabbath in the synagogue. But they resisted, they opposed, and they blasphemed. He preached to the Jews the message of Jesus Christ, but they didn't really want to hear it. They opposed him and they spoke against him, and he found himself going next door to the synagogue to a house where he began to teach. And many of those in Corinth placed their faith in Christ, not from the synagogue, but from next door, because the synagogue had rejected him. And after founding this church, about 4 years later, a number of problems had arisen. There was division in the church. I know that does not sound like it makes any sense. Division in the church. That ought to be an oxymoron. It ought not ever exist, but there was division in the church at Corinth. There was immorality in the church. Again, this ought never exist. But Paul hears about what's going on in the church that he founded just a few years earlier on his second missionary journey. And not only is there division in the church, there's immorality in the church. Here's what's really sad about the immorality that was going on. It was tolerated and approved of in the church. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in part because the church that he founded and considered to be his spiritual children were not behaving like the church. They were behaving like unbelievers. He tried to express to them, at this point, you ought to be mature. At this point, you ought to be spiritual. But at this point, you still are acting like little babies, still on milk. You ought to be eating meat, but you're not acting right. There was a lack of love for one another. So no matter what immorality there was, no matter what problems there were, no matter what division there was, the love chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, was written because there was a lack of love in the church. Please don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that we get to just give a pass to immorality in the church. We just get to give a pass to division in the church. It ought never be. But if we love right, that can deal with division. If we love right, that can deal with immorality. Instead of being bankrupt, if we love and love well, then instead of blaspheming, we can act like true believers. No matter what I say, no matter what I believe, no matter what I do, I'm bankrupt without love. It might seem silly, but talking more than loving can lead to bankruptcy. Corinth was a religious place. It was also an immoral place. And words themselves can be hollow. Doesn't matter how eloquently somebody speaks them, words can have less meaning than life. If I had time, I'd walk you through Genesis chapter 37 through 50, where one of my favorite characters, Joseph, found himself dealing with the talk of his brothers. His brothers sold him into slavery and took a tunic or a cloak that he was wearing, dipped it in blood, took it to their daddy, and said, do you happen to know who this might belong to? And he came to the conclusion that that was Joseph's coat, and they knew he would. He came to the conclusion that his beloved son Joseph was dead. And they were fine with that. They talked up a messed up situation to their dad about their brother that they had done. There's a show on right now. I haven't watched it. Kind of want to, but I kind of don't. It's about the Menendez family. You know, good old Lyle and Eric and their parents and the tragedy that beset that family. I wasn't there, but I imagine they were doing too much talking and not enough loving. Whatever angst there was between the parents and the children, too much talking, not enough loving. Our role and responsibility in this life is to love more than we talk. There's a dog in that study back there who's not making any noise, who I'm so proud of right now. When I went in to put my robe on, he was just laying down with his paws crossed and just looked at me silently. I'm so proud of him. Not once has Deacon ever uttered a word of the English language. He may bark, but he doesn't really talk. He doesn't enunciate. He does not pronounce English language. He's never articulated the words, I love you. But there's no doubt in my mind that four-legged creature loves me. He has no words. And yet every day he shows me he loves me. We need to be loving in such a way that our talk doesn't get in the way, but our lives show our love. How can there be division if there's love? How can there be immorality if there's love? If we do it right, if we love right, if we love well, we don't have to say a word. We can just love. Believing can lead to bankruptcy. Corinth was a church, but they were in need of correction. Joseph's brothers, they believed they could change that dreamer's outcome. They believed they could change what Joseph said God was going to do in his life. They believed they could do and alter eternity. But what they don't know is that when God puts his hands on somebody, when God is with somebody, there's nothing you can say or do that's going to alter what he ordains. So they may have tried to mess with Joseph. They may have sold him into slavery. They may have turned their backs on him. They may have shamedly presented a bloody coat that represented him to a daddy who almost died out of desperation for his lost son. But they did not alter experience based on what they believed. I don't know what Lyle and Eric were thinking. I don't know what it is that they experienced and how traumatic it was, and by no means am I wanting to excuse poor behavior by parents. But their response was unreasonable. Their response was out of order. What they believed, evidently as a family, is that money was more important than people. Evidently what they believed as a family is that power was more important than people. Evidently what they thought as a family is that prestige mattered more than people. Because if you love people right, money, power, and prestige take a distant second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever place it needs to be, but not before people. Despite what you believe, how you're treated, how somebody comes your way, brothers and sisters, I want to encourage you to love. Regardless of the talk that goes on, I want to encourage you to love. Regardless of what happens to you, how somebody treats you, what they do to you, I want to encourage you to love. Talking can't mean more than love. Believing can't mean more than love. I know Deacon sometimes has absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. I'll say something to him and he'll be like, and it's funny when he does it like multiple times. It can be hilarious to just watch him trying to figure out what is this human talking about. But when he doesn't understand what I'm saying, when he doesn't know how to believe in what I'm saying because he doesn't get what I'm saying, guess what? He still loves me. Despite not understanding, despite not comprehending. Sometimes we don't know what's going on with somebody else and why they're coming at us the way they do, but we are still responsible and accountable to love in response to all that God has done for us. Talking cannot mean more than love. Believing cannot mean more than love. And doing cannot mean more than love. Having a position doesn't make you right. And having a position doesn't make you loving. I still want to point a finger at politicians right now because I cannot stand political ads that are so busy trying to point fingers and talk about what somebody else has done wrong. And we live in sound bites and we hear bits and pieces of what somebody had to say and we think that we understand, and yet we get stuck. Joseph's brothers did so much harm to him. And yet when the opportunity presented itself, he loved them. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, but when his chance came and he was in power, he provided for them. Joseph's brothers turned their backs on their blood. They fought over position and they were concerned about things going their way, even though they couldn't orchestrate a thing against God. And God, who was with Joseph time after time after time, when he had the opportunity to do whatever he wanted to them, he loved them. And attributed to God the fact that everything that happened simply could have been a part of God's plan. Brothers and sisters, we have the opportunity to love despite what people do to us. Lyle and Eric didn't act out of a bankrupt position. That's a dangerous way to act. That's a dangerous way to behave. To be so desperate, frustrated, hurt, upset, that you act out of anger and bankruptcy when we're called to act out of love. It hurt my heart as a grown man to watch my parents, who had been married for 34 years, get a divorce. I blamed my dad. I said what I wanted to say to him without going too far. And I had this angst against him for a long time. Then I had to come to the conclusion that that old man wasn't getting ready to change his ways. So I needed to be loving and approach him in love. And I'm thankful that I did, because despite being divorced, when the time came and my mom was in the hospital, and my mom was at a place where my sister and I had to make a decision about whether to keep her incubated or let her go, my dad was there to support us in our decision for one of life's most difficult challenges. And if I had acted out of anger, if I had acted out of bankruptcy, that relationship would have been severed, and I wouldn't have been able to benefit from the love my dad was able to give and support he was able to give. We might want the charity that we do to look good to others, but it doesn't really matter how it looks on the outside. It matters what it really is and the why we're doing it on the inside. Anybody who's ever interacted with Deacon, if you've never fed him, he'll still love you. If you never put a roof over his head, he'll still love you. If you've never interacted with him or trained him or taught him anything to do, he'll still love you. He'll interact with you and be excited to see you and act like you're the greatest thing since sliced cheese. How dare a dog be better than the children of God, who he has called and blessed and gifted with relationships with other people? It tears my heart up to think that during the high holy days that are going on right now in the midst of the Middle East, bombs are going back and forth. They're acts done out of bankruptcy and anger and bitterness. And Paul wrote to the church at Corinth to try to tell us the way we behave isn't about being right, it's about being loving. Jesus is love. There was a time when I was working at a restaurant, 2491 South Braeswood at Kirby, called Nora's Restaurant. I was going to school at Prairie View A&M University. Car broke down and didn't work. I had to catch a Greyhound bus to get on a Houston Metro bus to get to work, and then try to get out of there early enough to get back on Metro, to get back on the Greyhound bus. And there were times when I didn't make enough money to cover my fare back and forth. One night, I was told by a patron that they would give me a ride to the bus stop so I could stay late and make a little bit more money. When it was time for me to go, they were gone. found myself with no ride in Houston, and I slept on the streets that smelled like urine. I felt bankrupt. I didn't make it to class on time the next day. None of the other students knew what I was going through. But because I didn't make a permanent decision because of my temporary situation, because I trusted a God who could be loving enough to care for me in spite of what I found myself in, because I could recognize that the love of God is still encompassing and caring even when we don't know how to work out what we've been through. Brothers and sisters, I say we ought to share that love with everybody we can whenever we get the opportunity. Jesus died on the cross, was raised again on the third day, and he's coming back for his church without spot or wrinkle. Let's not behave like the world and act like they've got it right and can influence us. Let's be so loving that no matter what anybody says, no matter what anybody believes, and no matter what anybody does, we will be loving, and they'll know us by our love and accept that Jesus